Technology and Teachers College, Columbia University. She has both a bachelor's and a master's in biology, completed her Ph.D. at Florida State University. And she is also the founding associate director for the Center for Innovation in Teacher Education and Development with King's College in London. Dr. Mensah's work centers social justice and anti-racism in science teaching and learning. She examines ways in which we can support pre-service and in-service teachers' identity work towards racial literacy and more equitable and justice-oriented teaching of science. Her research draws on years of experience teaching and outreach in pre-K-12 schools and post-secondary education. And she's also a dedicated academic mentor. And in that vein, if you need some great advice about writing, she's the author of Like Words Falling Onto the Page, Demystifying the Academic Writing and Publishing Process. Dr. Mensah has numerous awards, including several teaching innovation awards. She has also been recognized for her scholarship by leading professional organizations. She was awarded the Outstanding Science Teacher Educator of the Year from Ph.D. and Early Career Award for Division K ARA and Equity and Ethics Scholar from NARS. And it is really both an honor and a great pleasure to have her here today, sharing her work with us. And I expect to be learning a lot from you today. So thank you. Without further ado, Dr. Mensah, please.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for having me. Ravik, thank you for inviting me. And I've known Ravik for a long time. We knew each other when we were postdocs together, so many years. And I won't reveal our ages, but we know each other for a long time. And thank you all for those also on Zoom that are joining, and those who came to be present with us, and all of those who worked to try to get me here. I wasn't far away, but seemingly my trip here made it seem like I was far, far, far away. I'm glad to be with you this morning. I'm going to actually this afternoon. You all seem far, far, far away when you're all listening, but hopefully the presentation will engage us. You know, look forward to having some Q&A with you. I'm also excited because this is new work that I've been doing. So you have a chance to hear about it, engage with me in conversation. Also those who are in the Zoomosphere, be able to engage with me as well. So not a whole lot of intro in terms of the presentation, but hopefully we have a really good engaged conversation around this work that I'm going to share with you. So engaging in difficult discussions on race and teacher educator preparation through visual media and critical reflection. So imagine, right? Imagine. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. You have heard that phrasing before. And I wanted to take it up and say, let's talk about that in the context of the course that I developed for my doctoral students. So let's talk about that and give you a chance to talk about it a little bit with some of the images that I want to show with you in a very short period of time as we engage with you today. But all educators have experienced the impact of race and racism, whether we know about this consciously or unconsciously throughout our K-12 education, in teacher education, in our doctoral preparation. And this is really the bulk of my research that I've been doing, kind of like in this almost like second half of my work that I've been doing. But we know that educators are not well equipped to be able to engage in conversations, these difficult conversations, courageous conversations, some people call it, around race and racism in teacher education, nor are they equipped to be able to talk about it in professional development or in-service teachers, or the work that I've been doing most now around our doctoral preparation for teacher educator preparation. But one of the quotes that I've been really ruminating around is this quote from Leonardo and Grubb, who says, as teachers hone their skill of race awareness, and I've emphasized this idea of race awareness, have to kind of come into this awareness of what it is, that they start to understand that there's this recursive relationship between practice and reflecting upon race. And this is really the bulk of what I wanted to design within the course that I have, is that I wanted my pre-service teachers, my doctoral students to really think about how do you think about it, critically, but also how do you embed it within your practice? And then for me as a teacher educator, how do I show that in the development of this course and also practice it as a teacher educator so that they can also see it? So that's really the design of the course that I had for them to be able to do that. This relationship between practice and this relationship between the reflective practice of being able to talk about it. So the theoretical framing around this, because I know some of you all are doctoral students out there thinking about theoretical lenses. So racial literacy and racial consciousness were the major foundations of this under the big umbrella of critical race theory. But my dear friend Yolanda Cedar Ruiz has been doing work around racial literacy for a while. She's an English educator, but she talks about it as being the ability to read, to discuss, and to be able to write about situations that involve racial issue situations within the context of English literacy. But for me, I want to be able to say, well, how do you read, discuss, and write about it in teacher educator preparation? And then Shayla Haynes has been doing work with faculty development around racial consciousness. But so for me, it's the marriage of those two ideas of racial literacy and racial consciousness. So she says, well, it's an in-depth understanding of the racialized nature of our world. For me, I'm looking at the racialized nature of teacher education. So then how do we think about that through critical reflection, being able to look at the assumptions that we have, the privileges and biases that we think about in the context of teacher education, where it's centering the relationship of teachers and teacher educators. And then what is our worldview related to race and racism? So our experiences, again, within the context of teacher education. And so I had to think about, in the development of this course, what was kind of like some fundamental organizing features of this particular course that I have for students to be able to learn. And I've been teaching this course for about 8 years. It was gone through different iterations, but I started thinking about as a project for research, what did it look like? And what are kind of the core features of this course that I've been developing for this number of years? And these were the kind of the 5 features that have been bubbling up or have been really grounded in the course. So making the familiar strange. I'm not sure if you all have heard that terminology before. It comes out of anthropology. And it was one of the first concepts that I learned when I was taking one of our classes with at Florida State. And it's this whole idea of things that we were used to. How can we start to think about them differently? And in our experiences, we've gone to school before, we've done teacher education before, but I really wanted my students to say, well, how do we start to think about teacher education differently? How do we overlay these understandings of teacher education with a racial lens? The other one was like, how do we start to question our previous knowledge? Again, connecting to this idea of thinking about it differently, making the familiar strange. And the biggest one was, how do we start having conversations with ourselves? That internal work that we have to do to start thinking about race and the impact of race on our experiences. And then I wanted to be able to set up a community of support within the classroom environment. A lot of it, because we went through COVID, what I'm going to be sharing with you was actually the class that I taught online. So we were in COVID. So then I had to think about, how do I set up a classroom environment remotely so we could engage in these conversations together? And then we had to put it in practice. So putting it in practice means, how do we teach about it? Not only in the context of giving them an opportunity to teach it among themselves, but the students in the class were also classroom teachers, and some of them were also adjuncted. So then how did they take the things that they were learning in the context of this course that they were involved in? How did they put it into their practice as teachers? So these were kind of like foundational concepts for learning within the class. So it's called the Critical Voices in Teacher Education course that I developed. Okay. That popped up there. Thank you. So these were the main features that were part of the course. It involved large and small group interactions and discussions, and we had lots of time to discuss among ourselves. There were group assignments, there were co-teaching opportunities that came about for the class. Part of it was that I did the beginning of the class, the middle of the class, and then there was an opportunity for them to work together to teach the class in terms of co-teaching together. Then I kind of like took the class back at the end. We did readings of the normal things that you do in a course of research articles, book chapters. They read my work in teacher education, so a lot of the readings to be able to think about. The main feature, which I'm going to talk about in terms of my presentation today, was movie clips, video clips, and images, pre and post writes. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that is. And they also was able to engage in small scale research projects. I wanted them to be able to think about, as being teacher educators, what does research look like? So being able to engage, collect data, analyze data for themselves as researchers. So these were my research questions. I had many research questions that came out of this project. But these are two that started the kind of like germinate most for me, that I wanted to collect data and start to really and have a major study around. But I was more interested in the visual artifacts that came out of class. We used lots of visual artifacts as prompts in the class to engage in these conversations. And I wanted to know how important, or how were we using these visual artifacts for the development of their racial literacy and their critical consciousness, or their racial consciousness within the classroom, and what were they saying around some of these ideas of us being able to use these visual artifacts, and then what was the conversations that they were having with self that they as they were using these visual artifacts. And this is what you all are going to be able to get some insights about. So these were the students in the class. Actually, the class was made up of 12 students, but 8 of them consented to participate. I went through the RIB process for the class, so 8 consented. This was just last year, so spring class of 2022. As I said before, it was taught remotely for all the sessions. The class was a 2-hour long class. So 7 females and 1 male. So you can see their self-identifications, their age range. And this particular class is one that's open to students across the campus. So the ones who participated in this one was actually students that were 4 students in science education, 4 students in curriculum and teaching. 1 student is actually from another university, so we are part of a consortium so they can take classes outside of attending Teachers College. So I did have 1 student that was in that, and that was part of that cohort of students. Most of them were doctoral students, either in their 2nd year or 3rd year students. And as I said before, most of them were K-12 teachers, but I did have 2 students who were adjunct at TC, and 1 was also adjunct at another university. So a variety of students, right, in terms of their background and their experiences. So what did I want from them? The class kept an e-journal, which was Google document where they kept all of their writings throughout the semester, notes from the readings that we did in class. But the e-journal was actually a dialogue that they had with me for the entire semester. It was only read by me. It was a dialogue that they had in terms of the readings and writings throughout the semester. So it was like a critical dialogue of conversation. So it was my opportunity to be able to push their thinking a little bit more. It was an opportunity for them to have that internal dialogue, those self-dialogues with themselves. But one of the major features of this e-journal was for them to be able to write based upon the pre and post writes that we had in class. So at the beginning of each class session, we did 5 minutes of pre-writing, where I would show either a movie clip, a very short clip, no more than anywhere from, well, actually no more than 2 minutes at the most. But we would show a movie clip, and they had 5 minutes just to write what their initial thoughts were. At the end of each class session, we had 5 minutes of a post-write where they can just think reflectively about the conversations that happened in class. At the end of the semester, they had to go back and reread all of their pre and post-writes, which I call the final thoughts paper. And the directions for the final thoughts paper was to go back and say, what themes came up in your writing? What kinds of thinking came out of your pre and post writes? What was your learning throughout? Go back and address some of the questions and dialogue that you had with me throughout the semester. So it's almost like a little bit of an analysis of their pre and post writes of their journals. And then there was a course evaluation, which was a series of questions that I gave to them related to, you know, what were their thoughts about discussions of race in teacher education? What were some of their thinking about the importance of race conversations in teacher education or teacher education development? Then there were some questions related to me and how the course was structured, or anything that you would like to improve. So the course evaluation was their learning, but also some things and comments and commentary they can offer to me. So that was what I used in terms of the collection for my study, for this part of the study. So I went through the traditional ways of doing the analysis of the first level coding of it for each individual person, so I can get a synopsis of the individuals, like how did each individual person was learning throughout their journal, with the reading, rereading, the open coding. So I used I did use methods of constructivist grounded theory through that process. And then I went through a second level of coding, looking at the collection of the class as a whole, trying to understand their descriptions, trying to understand what they thought of the different images. So for this particular study, what I'm sharing with you is just little snippets of it for time's sake, but I was really interested in looking at how did they respond in the pre and post writes of the images that were shared in class, or the movie clips that we shared in class? Because part of that, they did engage in conversations in class when we shared them, if they wanted to. But I was the only person that read their journals, and so I was the only person that had the conversations with them. But if they wanted to share what their thinking was around some of these images, they were free to do that in our class discussions and conversations. But I wanted to know, what did they think initially? So that some of these ideas were their raw, especially in their pre-thoughts, were kind of like their first initial reactions to the conversations of being able to see the images that were shown. Some of the images, I created myself. Some of the images were constructed from the readings, and I'm going to show you some of those just so you will see them. But when I show the images to you, just for the sake of time, they had 5 minutes. I'm only going to give you like 5 seconds. So just kind of think about it. When I show you the images, just kind of think like, first 5 seconds, what do you think about the images as they come up? And then I'll share share the thoughts and all of that, of what they came out. So there are 5 things that came out of my initial coding of what these images were. So just as a little snippet, sharing 5 of them with you today. From the first session, I'll share that one with you, class number 2. Then I'm going to share something a little bit towards the end of the class session. So class number session 8, and then class session number 9. So I'm sharing these because these are the ones that I did at the beginning of the class and the ones kind of at the end of the class. There were some in the middle of the class. And as I said, I modeled for them how to use images and use movie clips. And so when they had the opportunity in their co-teaching, some of them use images or clips themselves when they were able to do some co-teaching. But I'm just sharing the ones that I did with them in class for myself. Okay. So these are the findings. So these are the 4 major things that came out. And then the 5th one is a little bit more of a synopsis that came out of their final thoughts paper, kind of like summarizing the importance of being able to think about critical reflection and the importance of what these images or these movie clips meant for them in their learning. So here we go. This is the first one. Give you 5 seconds to think about this. That was a long 5 seconds. That was more like 10 seconds. I gave you 2 5 seconds. So this was the first one in terms of the conversation that came on. So you can see this is an image about a famous editorial cartoonist. And I've seen this image before, and I thought, oh, it's such an appropriate image to be able to show on the first class, and to be able to think about what this looks like. So this is mine trying to set the agenda. And so this is actually very common in terms of what happens. So it brought up images and conversations in class about, like even children, like, when you go into a classroom setting or you go into the cafeteria, you see this often. And so even teachers, and so students often talked about, oh yeah, when we even go to teachers meetings or anything like that. Even in here, if you even look around here, you notice how this is almost kind of like the same image. And so we often segregate ourselves based upon race and ethnicity and things of that sort. So the conversation and questions I brought up, it is like, what do you think they're saying in terms of conversations about race and teacher education? And then the ideas of affinity spaces and affinity groups are coming up. So I wanted them to talk about this and write about it a little bit. Based upon this. So when they're like, what do you think they're talking about and asking each other in these different groups? So sometimes we're not privy to like the conversations that are actually happening with one another. So just a couple of comments that some of the students said related to this one. So the theme that came out of this is these ideas around divergences and convergences. So Kelly says, like, I would imagine that a group of white teachers is talking about anything but race because they have been socialized to avoid it. Most white people have been socialized to believe in a myth of meritocracy, so they may be asking the other group how to reach students and families who are not white. And then my other student said, Tia, she says, well, the Black and brown group may see race conversations brought into teacher education in a more direct way, more often or in general. The white affinity group, due to their own experiences, may also want to see it brought into teacher education in a more direct way or in a general way, or et cetera. However, there may be some differences noted here between the two groups. So even in our class discussion, they often talked about the differences in what was going on in the conversations that were happening in the two groups. So for me, this kind of like set the stage and the agenda. I wanted to say, well, we can't really have these two separate conversations going on all the time. It was fine for us, and actually throughout the semester, we had conversations where I did want to have these separations because there's a need for us to have conversations in affinity spaces for these separations. But there are often times where we actually need to have these conversations, these difficult dialogues, these courageous conversations with everybody present, being able to talk about it and be able to understand one another. So I set up for the class like, yeah, we're going to have some of these conversations. They're going to be challenging. And I tell them, say, yeah, you probably will offend somebody. We're still going to have these conversations. And I wanted them to be able to practice what it means to be able to have these conversations and still say, maybe well-meaningly that you may offend somebody, but what does that mean towards a group understanding of getting these conversations out and being able to understand one another. And so we did that in class. There were times where people did offend one another, but we were also trying to reach an understanding around what that meant. So that was number one that came out of the conversation around this one. Image number two that I want to share with you. So I'll go ahead and give you double 5 seconds on this one too. Okay, so what do you think of this one? And do hold your thoughts because we can have Q&A at the end. Talk about this, okay? So the thing that came out of this is the ideas of non-traditional conversations about diversity and race. So again, the conversations that came out of for this particular day, one of the things I also wanted to set up for the class is that we can't do teacher education the way that we've always done teacher education. And this was the basis for my actually developing this course in the first place. And so this idea of teacher prep 3.0 is like, we've had 2.0 and now we're going to move to 3.0. And so that we have to be able to think about, teacher education, teacher educators, and the same way that we talk about our students are not empty vessels. Teacher educators are not empty vessels. And so we have to be able to think about, as Yen says, that we have to become agents and activists and take action. So we have to be able to develop this idea of being teacher educators and activists at the same time so that we can address inequities and discrimination. Also, Sue says, well, it's not another traditional way of doing things. So we have to be able to be clear about what that means. If we're going to change the way that we go into schools and be teachers and teacher educators, then we're going to have to not teach the same way. There should be a round of table discussions where teachers are able to talk and teacher educators are going to have to listen. So here she said, like, even our role as teacher educators are going to have to change. We have to start we must start getting comfortable discussing uncomfortable topics and issues. And this is a spillover from that first discussion that we had the day before or the week before. And so we cannot do things the same way every time and expect a different result. And so in the conversation that we had also in class early on, I asked them, what was their teacher education like? And so as we had conversations about what is your teacher education like, then we had to we started seeing patterns that everybody's teacher education experiences were very similar. And we started talking about, well, if our teacher education experiences were similar, when are they going to change? If we were continually getting the same results. And so for me, it was like giving them that major charge to say, then things are going to have to change, and it's going to have to start with them. If they're the next generation of teacher educators, then their practice is going to have to look differently. And then it's going to have to be changed. It's going to have to look different because they're going to have to change it. So let's move on. So this is one that I also created. So think about this thought. So I'll read this particular quote just for emphasis sake. So one of the books that we read was Vanilla Silva's textbook, what, Racism Without Racist Without Racism. And this was from a post-doc where we talked about accountability this particular week, this particular session. So few have asked, what are the sociological and social psychological, and then I put educational consequences of whites living in primarily white environments, or whites staying in silos in educational settings, or being taught mostly by white teachers and professors? What are they missing? So I just want you all to think about that. Okay, Zoom people, I hope you're thinking too. Okay. Let's see what else. So the theme that came out of this one was silo, separation, and loss. So Jack says, not being able to experience the different cultures eventually creates an environment that has a lack of exposure. He says that the danger of whites living in white culture is that they will not have the ability to recognize the privilege and problems which would cause them to repeat the same issues that are currently being discussed. So this lack of exposure and not being able to recognize privileges and problems if we're being separated, you know, in one direction again. So can you see kind of this theme that has been coming out related to the beginning of the class, and now we're at the end of the class. And so this kind of recurrence of a theme is coming out. One of the things that I noticed. And then here's a little bit, so Tia had a whole lot to say, even related to this one in her post thought around this. So she says, by remaining in their racial silos, white people are missing out on a realistic sense of self, the world and their place in it. So the text that we talked about, so I'll give you a little bit more context about this particular reading that we had this particular week. Like in the Vanilla Silva text, he actually conducted a study where he interviewed white people, black and brown people, related to where they felt kind of like in their hierarchy of experiences and privileges. And so she's talking about this, and we actually engage in conversations about this in class, and how different narratives are being told about what people have in terms of privileges. And so it kind of provoked me in some ways of why I created that sign about the different directions and how narratives are being told and people are like missing each other. And so that's why I kind of like had the arrows going in different directions. So that's kind of my interpretation of that particular reading. So again, going back to Tia, so she said the Vanilla Silva text highlighted all the ways that whites were able to hold on to untruths in an effort to save face and perpetuate lies about Black people. For example, like a Black man stole my job, or they had to give a seat to a minority, even though the other person had higher scores on the LSAT. These lies, which were often posed by someone who knew someone, always worked to reify false narratives about Black people and served to maintain the racial divide. As noted in Vanilla Silva, these storylines and testimonies often went unquestioned, which allowed them to move from urban legend to the status of factual. With further inquiry, one might recognize that the reason why someone did not get a job or get a certain job was due to the work history. So throughout the course, we started to try to unravel these ideas about stories being told, truths and untruths, of what is the truth, whose truth are we telling? And so there are lots of times that throughout the course where we had to go back and question. That goes back to that, one of the foundations of the class is like, how do we start to question things that we thought that we knew to be true? And that came up often in the class. And I wanted them to be able to do that. And even to the point of being in classrooms and like policies and structures that were happening in classrooms. I'm like, why do you do that? Or why do we have a certain policy in the school? Like, or you've heard something like, we've always done it that way. And mine are like, why? So just really trying to unravel these kind of like systemic issues that were going on. Like, why do you always do it that way? Who is it serving? So just really asking these questions. And so these are kind of the things that were coming up as well. And oftentimes it always has this kind of racial reasoning behind it. Let me go on to the next one. So evaluating our roles, part one. So again, this is when I'm taking the class back again, like just really trying to emphasize the things that were happening throughout the course. So based upon discussions today, and I can give you again context of what today was, how does the cartoon reveal the importance of bringing racist and anti-racist ideas to the forefront in teacher education? So I'll give you 5 seconds to think about this image. And smiling racism is the theme that came out of this one. So Yin says that the man was trying to look like a non-racist while not being able to afford to have anyone of minority groups be near him. This makes me think about the teacher candidates within a teacher preparation program. How many of them are just pretending to be non-racist using a colorblind ideology maybe? And so one of the things I think that was happening in the course towards the end, and so in the beginning of the course, I told them that there will be a lot of language that will be introduced to them. And that often there's even this whole idea of what racial literacy meant. Literacy is the idea of being able to understand language. And I wanted them to be able to understand language, not only in terms of what it meant, but be able to have some representation of what language is. And so to me, this is one of these examples, is that colorblindness, people say colorblindness all the time. And so to me, this image was able to give them an example, kind of like a concrete way of like what colorblindness really meant. And I liked the way that Ian was able to pick up on that. So this was just one of those examples. And then here's Tia, she said, well, the cartoon speaks to the larger problem that we have in our society, that people want to appear open and humane in terms of seeing everyone as human beings, but in reality, they do not want to actually interact with minoritized groups. And so some of this too brought to the forefront of conversations that we had earlier, where the interactions that a lot of the students had were not like true interactions. And it made them come up or made us have conversations about what was happening in schools, where young people know if their teachers like them or not, or young people know the relationships that they have with the teachers are true or not. And so again, it's these ideas about what we were learning in the class in terms of the course, like what does it look like in reality in the classrooms when you're interacting with young people? And so this cartoon brought that out as well. It's like students know if a teacher is genuine with them or has their best interest at heart. And then what does that really mean? And then so for us as teacher educators, how do we relay that information back to the teachers that we're preparing, our pre-service teachers, for them to truly be invested in the learning of young people? And then so I've had experiences where I've had my pre-service teachers say, they're afraid to go into the schools in Harlem. Then what does that mean if you're trying to be their, you're their teacher? How does that relationship come back to play? And teachers and students be like, you don't even want to come into my community. How are you going to teach me? So again, it's like being really real about what that means for them, but students can read that when you come into their classroom and come into their community. So here we are. These images again, how important are these images? And for me, being able to bring these images out so that they help us to dig a little bit deeper because they're unexpected in some ways, right? They're unexpected in the way that that they're brought out, or even the video clips that I bring to them first to be able to engage to be able to engage in these conversations. And so here, dynamic intellectualism came out as kind of almost like a finding as well as a discussion. So the process of reflection was very dynamic. So to me, this process of critical reflection is very dynamic. And so Jack says, as I read more articles, I learned that racism can be present in any shape or form. And throughout the semester, we talked about racism from all aspects of what it could be talked about in teacher education. So from school to work, from individual to the whole, and also in society, we talked about it all over the place. To the point the students said, like, well, Dr. Mensah, because I was like, you have to put it on, it's almost like put it on, and I actually said that, like, put it on a racial lens. They're like, what happens when you see it everywhere? And I'm like, well, that's kind of like the fortunate or unfortunate way that it is, like, it's everywhere. And so in order to address this dynamic nature of the story, teacher preparation education also needs to be a dynamic process. So that goes back a little bit earlier too, from what I said, is like, we're gonna have to change the nature of what we do in teacher education. So it cannot be a single curriculum where the instructor is providing a lecture or giving a speech. More conversations, more discussions, more debates, and more sharing is gonna have to happen, so that our thinking and our experience are going to be needed. So I invite the students to bring in their experiences, to bring in things that are happening in the classroom. The conversations are always much more richer when they come from their classroom, and then, like, we're talking about these things in the moment. So, and this is going to help them to be able to promote growth and expand their viewpoints. And so I want them to be able to do that. So that makes it very dynamic. Even though I've taught this class for 8 years, it's different every semester. It's supposed to be. It's different every class session when we come in. I developed the syllabus, but I have no idea what's going to happen in terms of the conversations of that particular day. And so for me, it's very exciting in that particular way, but it's also very scary because I don't even know what's going to happen in the moment that it's going to happen. So teacher education has to be able to be that way, has to be nimble in that way to be able to account for these kind of like this dynamic intellectualism that's going to happen. And then Rolinda says, well, as I reflected in the videos and the images, the work if teaching it, so the work I think is teaching is cultural work. And it's cultural because of the diversity of the experiences of the teachers that come into the classroom. Articles and readings are important to have, and they do have their place. There's also something about the video clips, the images, and the cartoons that allow us to be able to open up, especially around difficult topics for which our language is so underdeveloped and simultaneously so deeply ingrained. So much of anti-racist teaching is exactly about that, talking about difficult things, unpacking the thinking. And it's not just intellectual. So she says that this idea around anti-racist teaching should be a subfield in teacher education. It's a topic that it needs to be a subfield. And to me, this is extremely important to be able to think about it being, a major part of teacher education. It has been a major part of my work as a teacher educator. So I'm hoping that they do see this as being an important part of teacher education, and they take this on as the next generation of teacher educators to continue this work. So here we are. These are major discussion points for me and for us to be able to engage on. So Bauer says that if race is merely a social construction, and we know it's not merely a social construction, but why is it so persistent, deliberating, and power-driven in educational settings and in our lived experiences? And it is so in all of that, but it's also in experiences as teacher educators and learners. So we know it is in our regular experiences, and if it is in our regular experiences and in society, then it has to also be so in teacher education and in our work as teacher educators. So then as teacher educators, we can work towards educational equity and empowerment. And we can do this if it's deliberate, if it's engaged, and it's intentional. And we also have to be very explicit about how we do that. And so when I developed this course, I was very explicit in trying to make sure that students had the opportunity to develop their racial literacy and their racial consciousness. I was very deliberate in trying to pick the right readings, trying to develop these images. I saw it for myself. I wasn't always sure that they would see what I wanted them to see, and it was fine if they did not. But it also gave me an opportunity to say, well, this is what I saw in the image, and I can explain it for myself and see if they saw it. And then it gave an opportunity for them to be able to share it with their particular experience. And then we were able to get even greater understandings from different perspectives. So I didn't come in expecting them to be able to see racial lens around everything, but it did broaden their idea to say like, oh, I didn't see it that way. And it also gave me a chance to say like, no, I didn't see it that way either. So it did expand our understandings and our collective understanding of racial literacy and racial consciousness in teacher education. So the visual media in critical reflection and writing is a process. I did not expect everybody to come in with a great understanding, but I expected them to be able to not be in the same position that they were when they came to class. And I give everybody that charge when they come in. There are some who are maybe along the continuum a little further than others, but I expect everybody to move. I expect myself to also move. I'm still developing my understandings as well. So when I think about the course and the development, again, these elements have been primary in terms of making the course come alive every year. I teach it every spring, except for last spring, come alive for me. And I'm already thinking about what it's going to look like next spring as I continue to reflect and look at this data as a researcher, but also continuously looking at it as a teacher educator. What am I going to change? What am I going to make different? What new images am I going to be able to bring up that can take the place of some of the ones that I have even shown for you, that's still going to allow us to develop our racial consciousness and our racial literacy. So that's what I have for you all.
Thank you so much. This was so rich. I have some questions. I'm gonna hold them. Others, and we have plenty of time for questions. So, you're on the Zoom, right? So, I don't know if there are any questions from the Zoom, but let's maybe take the first question from the room if we have a question in the room, and if not, we can move to the Zoom, and then we'll just go back and forth. So,
yeah. And if you want me to bring up an image, I can bring it up again if you need to look at it and talk about it.
I mean, I wasn't trying to jump.
oh,
No, go ahead, please.
The pressure. Maybe this was just like a theory or something that I just wasn't made aware of. I was just curious about, in the first image, there were the two different groups of people talking about race, and one of your student responses talked about how it enforces the myth of meritocracy. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what that was.
Mm-hmm. So this is a learning environment as well. Does anybody know what meritocracy is? Okay, let's share. Let's help everybody learn. What is meritocracy?
It's the idea that as you succeed, it's because you worked hard and earned it, which also implies that anyone who didn't succeed didn't work as hard as you really did, or that there isn't as hard.
it ignores the idea that it's not a level playing field, right? So there are much more obstacles and hurdles for certain groups. Probably not than there are for other groups. And so success doesn't actually reflect, certainly not only your efforts, but largely the environment.
And so often what happens in schools is that minoritized groups are often seen as being blamed for not being successful. That is, it's their fault or their community's fault that they're in the situations that they're in. And so for us in the class, we often have to talk about that. Like, what does that look like? You know, why is it that in that particular situation? Like, what led up to that? And so that's one of the things that cuts across the course often is that idea of meritocracy. And then it comes back in a personal ways, like how are you setting up your class? That becomes something that you do unknowingly. Yes.
Purchase on unlimited finance. Are there any questions from the?
There is a question in the
Okay.
chat. We can either read it or. I can
Why don't you read it and then ask if the person would like to speak up and say it, and if not, then.
Yeah, would you like to read your question in the chat, A?
Sure. I was just wondering some of the best ways you've found to address when one student may say or do something that offends another student.
So what we do when somebody offends another student?
Yeah, just the ways that you can address and unpack it without, making too much of it, but not acknowledging it and holding folks accountable. Yeah, just general ways of how to approach that.
Trying to think of an example.
I have an answer for that, Dr. Mensah, when I was in your
Okay.
class a couple of years ago.
Who is that?
That's Brittany.
Brittany Marshall, I had you like that semester that guy who killed George Floyd was found guilty.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, hi A. So in that semester we had someone in the class was very against social justice work, and she didn't really understand critical race theory, but she would bring it up in a negative way a lot. And I remember after class I stayed on to ask Dr. Mensah about it, like how she would address it. And one thing that was kind of wonderful was in the class, Dr. Mensah allowed another student to address it, like allowed other students to address it in very calm ways, and eventually talked to the student after class to not like embarrass them. But it was I just really appreciated it because I was getting frustrated a lot in the class, but luckily there were people in the class that were more professional than me and were able to like handle it in a calm way. And I know that Dr. Mensah talked to the student afterwards. So I felt like it was a way for the student to kind of see things from a different perspective, but not be put on the spot. So it was nice.
So good to see you. Thank you for that. Yeah. I mean, in other moments, trying to think like even before this class, there are other moments where there have been student, like the reflected journals are also important. So distinctly remember there was a time in a reflected journal where a moment came up and the student wrote about it. And because I'm the only one that reads the journals, I said, this was, very, I can't remember the exact language behind it, but the person felt bad for what they said in class. And I know that they had remorse for what came out. And I said, I appreciate you, saying this and reflecting about. I said, this will be an excellent point to go back and say in class. Next class session, they came back and apologized to the entire class. So again, I think it is these moments where you have to give people time because this stuff is hard, and they're grappling with the things that are going on internally. And so instead of kind of like going off and having these very intense moments, where everybody's kind of like fighting about it, give people time. And I think one of the things that happens in class, like I really do give people time and grace. And students have to, because I've asked like, why don't we have like these like explosive moments often? And people have come back and said it's because of me. I have a very kind of like calm and at ease kind of like mannerism. I've always had it. But I think in the context of the class, I want everybody to develop that as well and have that kind of like that grace about it and give people a little bit of that benefit of the doubt and give people time to come back to themselves. And normally people do, they come back and they apologize. I thank people for sharing things that was hard for them. And they come back strong in those ways of being able to say, I'm sorry that I said that last week or whatever, or I didn't mean to offend anybody. But I tell people, I know you're gonna offend people. And they say, well, I didn't mean to offend you, but I did, or whatever. So we have to give people time to do that. And it's practicing it is practice because it's gonna happen. It happens in your schools, it happens in your family. So people come back and tell me what happened, in conversations with their boyfriends or their husbands or their uncles or their cousins or whatever. So they're practicing it in the moment. so they can go back and have these difficult conversations outside of the classroom. So they're able to practice it with us in the class and then go back out. So yeah, you're gonna have these difficult moments. How do you grow in them? How do you practice them? But how do you grow in them? So that's why all that selfness, that self-work is gonna be really important for you. Yes.
Hi, Adam Mensah, thank you so much for the presentation. I should have brought more paper. I didn't know that. But thank you for bringing us well to your points. I think we are working on similar lines. Thinking of that first cartoon, which I love it. I take a picture of it. One, because they're basically the same figurines, but then like the differentials come with like hair. I think there's like a meta commentary on that there. But I'm thinking about how if I was to see this in the teacher prep course and I am a Black person, then in some of these exercises, which some folks really speak to as people of color, as Black folks, here we are now becoming both object and subject of these conversations and topics, which is a huge difference from this other thing we think of ideas of how white is associated with like race neutrality and white people are often unraced. So that conversation already starts which we see play out in maybe not even a graduate seminar, but like an undergrad class when that one Black person down is now looked to the expert to guide these conversations. And so I'm just thinking like, how has that been an idea has come up? And then when there is this cross group interactions, how are we able to make space for the folks who may not have all the language equipped to engage and avoid offending someone? How do we make space for the folks who, like you mentioned, are seeing this all for the first time and are a little bit distraught versus people who arrive these exercises having navigated these conditions their entire lives and understand these things in ways that Christina Sharp describes as like the total climate, is as normal and encompassing as the air. Everything I do from how I'm perceived at Starbucks, people say my name wrong, to me being hyper-criminalized are all rooted in systemic racism. So how do we navigate those dynamics? I think go back to your idea of dynamic intellectualism without coddling whiteness. That's my biggest like stop sign is thinking like, I'm huge on the idea of let's call folks in instead of always calling them out. But at the same time, I'm worried of positioning this labor onto folks who are already like victimized by these dynamics on and on, which in what was supposed to be a critical learning space. So I said a lot, but that's because you came up with so many great things today. So any ideas or reflections on those?
I think the first thing that pops up for me is from what you said, and your name?
Travis.
I think about year 4, I stopped teaching this class for white people. And I started teaching this class for Black and brown people intentionally. And I say that because there was an assumption that my Black and brown students knew this, and they didn't. And there was also an assumption that like doing things differently. And because I was also teaching, my elementary methods class was predominantly white pre-service teachers. And we know the literature, we know it's predominantly white pre-service teachers that we're preparing. And I was missing something for myself because I was like, I don't want to teach it to them. Like there's this, I needed to grow. And I was like, so the development of this critical voices class, I'm like, this has to be a class for me. And so I started shifting a little bit. And then it wasn't so much to say like, okay, you all would catch up. It was almost like you'll catch up because it was like, I needed to be able to have a class where I was also preparing my Black and brown students to go out and armor them enough so that they didn't feel like they had to be able to be, so eloquently like what you said. Like I needed for them to be strong enough to be able to stand on their own and be okay to stand on their own. And so I just felt like the class needed to have a shift in perspective. And that's where I thought it came much more alive in terms of what I thought the class needed to be. So it was more of, there was something you said, there was another thing that you said, and all that you said that kind of caught me. Now I forgot it. It might come back later. It might not come back later. No, but I appreciate all that you said, because it really makes me reflect about why we do the work that we do, especially as scholars of color, and being almost like I don't want to say a rare population of us, but we're kind of rare. And then not to be able to live up to expectations of what we're supposed to do for others, but what we're supposed to do for ourselves and our communities. And so I have to always keep that forefront for me and not forget it. And I think it one year I forgot it. And so, but I've come back to it. And so that I think that's what it is. And I think for all of us, I mean, and I think it's the bigger picture of just the academy. And I often tell myself, like, know who you are, because the academy will tell you if you don't know. And so we have to be clear about that. And you can forget it, every now and then the academy can make you forget who you are. But I appreciate that. You might have to send your comments back to me so I can reflect. Are there other comments and questions?
Do we have another Zoom question, maybe?
We have one more, but we're also at.
Let's do one more question.
Oh, I don't want to.
One more question. Oh.
Get the wrong.
All right, Aaron, you put a question in the chat. You want to read the question?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. You mentioned earlier sort of pushback on meritocratic thinking. I was curious what you come upon in terms of like sort of genuine alternatives to meritocratic pedagogy, in particular ones that don't get a lot of pushback, especially from communities who might be anxious about their, like the socioeconomic status of their children and their well-being going forward.
Answer that question, Aaron. Can you rephrase it in a different way? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the critiques of meritocratic pedagogy and the ways that meritocracy reproduces class and all the kinds of problems I think that have been brought up by a bunch of several scholars on these issues. And I was just curious what alternatives you've seen that seemed appealing and that could be communicated persuasively to communities who might feel like they need to play the meritocracy game for the well-being of their children.
I don't know if it's two separate ways of thinking about that, but I guess for communities of color, for me, I teach in terms of empowerment and culturally relevant, responsive, culturally sustaining pedagogies. And I think that's practices that every community or every child should be able to learn. Empowerment for and liberation for, but then you have to be able to define for what for your particular community. But I think for children of color, it always should be about empowerment and betterment for themselves and their community. So if we think about culturally relevant, responsive, sustaining pedagogies, which is what we're not doing, I think this is a lot of why our children are not being so successful in schools. And this is another one of these changes that we have to do in teacher education. It's like we're not teaching our teachers that. Our teacher educators don't know a whole lot about that and don't know what it looks like, don't know how to do it. And so this is another one of those 3.0 changes we have to have in teacher education. So if we're doing that and teaching our teacher educators how to do that and do it well, then we can start to have some of this change in our in the ways that our schools look, what our children are learning, and how our community can also change. So I think that's the answer. If I'm understanding your question, I think that's the answer.
Thank you. So thank you so much. This has
Thank
been
you.
really rich, a lot of things to think about, I think a lot of great questions, and really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Still, my head is still buzzing with questions, so one, big round of applause. Next week.
Wait, unless Aaron, you have that handy.
Does Aaron have? Aaron, who do we
Nope,
have?
okay. Sorry?